I always thought college road trips were the best way to freeze youth in time. It was that brief window where we could wild out before the crushing weight of adulthood hit us. But reality didn't play out that way. Every time I smell burning plastic or feel the suffocating heat radiating off the asphalt in July, my mind drags me right back to Death Valley in 2019. That was our graduation trip. Something the four of us had hyped up and planned for 6 months straight. It was supposed to be the ultimate celebration of absolute freedom, but it ended up becoming a claustrophobic grave. To this day, I can't sleep a wink on summer nights unless my fan is blasting on high. I need that mechanical hum to drown out the memory of the wind howling through the cracked window of that RV. That summer, we pooled our cash together to rent a beat-up 2012 RV out of Las Vegas. The goal was to hit the most desolate, off-the-grid routes across Nevada. Vance was the guy bankrolling most of the trip, covering the rental and gas money. He was a rich, arrogant trust fund kid who had this magnetic, effortless charm, but beneath that exterior was a textbook narcissist who thought the universe revolved around him, driven by a sick obsession with controlling everyone. Then there was Shelby. She was shy, anxious, and a total people pleaser who would do anything just to avoid a confrontation. The last one was Kalen, a quiet, brilliant guy who had just scored a full-ride scholarship for his master's degree. I'd known Vance since our freshman year when we randomly got assigned as roommates. I knew exactly what kind of person he was. I could always see the cold selfishness hiding behind his grand, generous gestures. But like a coward, I always chose to play along and bite my tongue just to keep the peace. The endless blacktop stretched out ahead, swallowing our RV as we drove deeper into the most isolated stretch of Death Valley. The deeper we went, the more dead the landscape became. No signs of life, no oncoming traffic, nothing. Our entire world shrank down to yellow sand, dead tumbleweeds, and limestone cliffs radiating a brutal heat that pushed past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The very last bar of cell service vanished from our screens the moment we entered the dead zone of the desert. The no-service icon stared back at us, cold and stark. It was the official sign that our only lifeline to civilization had been completely severed. Around 9 p.m., the RV sputtered a few times and died right in the middle of a dry lake bed. Everything around us went pitch black instantly. The desert temperature plummeted, and the cold air hissed through the cracks of the metal frame. Vance stepped down to check the engine and came back up with a cryptic, half-smirk. He casually told us the electrical system was shot and we would have to wait until morning to fix it. To cut through the suffocating tension and growing fear, Vance pulled a bottle of heavy bourbon from his backpack. He slammed a worn-out leather notebook onto the table. He called the game The Reckoning. It was a psychological game he made up just to kill time. The rules were simple. Everyone had to confess their darkest, ugliest secrets. The mood inside the vehicle shifted fast when Vance bypassed the casual small talk. He flipped the notebook open and locked eyes with Shelby, like a predator sizing up its prey. Vance forced Shelby to admit that she had sabotaged her rival's research paper using a school account just to secure her spot as valedictorian. Shelby went pale, her lips trembling as she tried to deny it, but Vance slammed his phone onto the table, making a sharp cracking sound. "I have screenshots of the IP history right here. Stop acting, Shelby." He laid out the punishment for lying. Shelby had to take off her jacket and stand outside in the freezing desert wind with the wild coyotes for exactly 15 minutes. Kalen and I locked eyes, letting out a nervous laugh, thinking this was just a sick joke. I told Vance he was crossing the line and that we needed to focus on fixing the engine. Vance's expression hardened instantly, his voice cutting like glass. "Anyone who refuses to play is betraying this group. And tomorrow, I'm leaving them behind to walk 30 miles for help." Watching Shelby sob as she walked toward the door in the biting cold, I stayed silent. I stepped forward and pushed the door open, letting her step into the dark wasteland. My cowardice officially handed power over our lives for the rest of the night. When Shelby stepped back inside the RV, her body was shaking uncontrollably. Her lips had turned a bruised purple from the ruthless desert cold, but Vance didn't flinch at all. His eyes showed the pure, twisted excitement of a power addict. He casually flipped to the next page of his leather notebook. His smirk grew even more vicious as he looked toward Kalen. "Your turn, genius. Tell the group about your drug test results from last week," Vance said with a mocking sneer. Kalen jumped to his feet, his face draining of color as he lunged to grab the notebook, but Vance was too fast. He raised the book high and stepped back with a smug grin. He threatened to send the evidence directly to the Master's Scholarship Board the moment we got signal if Kalen refused to play. "You think you are so clean?" Vance whispered close to Kalen's ear, his voice dripping with manipulation. "Chug half of this bourbon bottle with no ice, or your future turns to ash tonight." I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed forward, grabbed Kalen's arm, and screamed right into Vance's face. "Vance, are you insane? He has a congenital heart condition. You know damn well high-proof alcohol will kill him." Vance looked at me with pure disgust. He spat directly onto the dirty floor of the RV. "Shut up, you coward," he snapped. "You have always been a freeloader in this group. Would you even be on this trip without my money?" Kalen turned to look at me. His eyes were filled with complete desperation and helplessness. The absolute terror of losing his scholarship and the future he worked so hard for completely crushed his survival instinct. Before I could even move to stop him, Kalen snatched the bottle from Vance's hand. He began gulping it down. Vance stood right beside him, slowly clapping his hands. The steady demonic rhythm echoed eerily inside the cramped RV. Less than 5 minutes after draining the heavy liquor, Kalen suddenly clutched his chest tightly. His breathing broke into horrific choking sounds. He collapsed heavily onto the floor. Kalen's entire body began to convulse violently. His eyes rolled back toward the ceiling. Thick foam bubbled out of his mouth. It quickly mixed with streaks of bright red blood from a ruptured esophagus caused by severe irritation and acute heart failure. Shelby screamed in pure horror. She threw herself down to hold Kalen's head so it wouldn't slam against the floorboards. I frantically pulled my phone out of my pocket. My shaking fingers woke up the screen to search for any shred of hope, but the screen still displayed that lonely, cold message. No service. Vance's twisted psychological game had officially turned into a life-or-death crime scene. The inside of the RV was now choked with the heavy stench of alcohol, blood, and the agonizing gasps of a man dying in the middle of a barren wasteland. I dropped to my knees right next to Kalen. I interlaced my fingers, placing my hands on his trembling chest. I started performing CPR, desperately trying to recall everything from those panic-inducing first aid classes. Every time I pressed down, a sickening crack echoed from Kalen's sternum. Cold sweat rolled down my forehead, dripping onto my friend's face as it turned an ashen gray. "Kalen, please wake up," I screamed in utter futility. Shelby sobbed uncontrollably while using a wet paper towel to wipe the bloody foam clinging to Kalen's chin. She looked up, shouting directly at Vance with a raw, hoarse voice. "Vance, please save him. You have a satellite messenger in your backpack, right? Bring it out now." But Vance didn't even flinch. He just stood there with his arms crossed, leaning casually against the driver's seat. His eyes were completely dead, showing not a single shred of panic or remorse. He looked down at the three of us with pure disgust, like he was watching mice squirming inside a sealed iron trap. A suffocating weight of helplessness and guilt crushed my chest. I realized that my own silence, my cowardly compliance earlier, had directly pushed Kalen into the jaws of death. In a blind panic, I let go of Kalen to search for the first aid kit. I bent down, frantically tearing through the storage cabinets beneath the RV's kitchenette. My hands suddenly brushed against a heavy black plastic bag, hidden deep behind some old gear. I yanked the bag out into the open. My heart skipped a beat when I saw what was inside. It was the distributor cap from the RV's engine. Right next to it were 3 wires from the GPS navigation system, cleanly snipped with pliers. And the entire stash of our last 10 bottles of emergency water was packed tightly right there. I looked up at Vance, my whole body shaking with absolute terror. You sabotaged the vehicle? You intentionally trapped us out here?" Shelby completely broke down when she saw the items on the floorboards. She dropped to her knees, wailing through suffocating tears. "Vance did this to get back at us. The car accident in Boston last year, the 3 of us forced him to take all the legal blame and pay for the damages. Vance didn't even bother to deny it. Instead, he burst into a loud laugh, a dry, maniacal laugh that echoed through the cramped, suffocating space of the RV. "You honestly thought you could just walk away after destroying my reputation?" Vance roared, his eyes wide with unhinged fury. "Tonight, all of us are staying right here in Death Valley. We didn't die from the brutal conditions of Death Valley." Around 5 in the morning, a federal park ranger patrol spotted our broken-down RV. Shelby had used the last of her strength to drag the spare tire into the desert and light it on fire. The thick column of black smoke rising against the dawn caught their attention and saved our lives. Kalen was airlifted to a trauma center immediately, but it was already too late to save a brilliant life, because his brain went without oxygen for too long that night. Kalen was left in a permanent vegetative state. Right now, he lies motionless in an isolated care facility in Utah. Vance vanished into the desert night the moment the confrontation ended. He opened the door and ran straight into the pitch-black wilderness without a single bottle of water. A few days later, search teams only found his backpack and leather notebook abandoned 10 miles south of the RV. The authorities never recovered his body or found any trace of survival. Our 4-year college friendship completely dissolved that morning. Shelby quietly transferred to a school on the East Coast and cut off all contact with me. I deactivated all my social media, packed my bags, left the city, and never looked back. Our silent compliance during that horrific night became a brutal life sentence for my conscience. It eats away at my soul every single day when I remember Kalen's desperate, accusing eyes on the floorboards. Now, whenever I drive alone on pitch-dark roads at night, a chill runs down my spine. I constantly check the rearview mirror with a suffocating panic in my chest. I am terrified that I will suddenly see Vance's cold face and half-smirk staring back at me from the back seat. What happened in Death Valley destroyed my naive ideas about friendship forever. It taught me a devastating lesson in blood and tears about human boundaries. I learned that weakness is not standing up and saying no to toxic pressure. Walking away from someone when you sense danger is not a betrayal. True weakness is choosing to stay silent, turning a blind eye, and playing along with evil. Because in the end, you will find yourself on your knees, letting a monster decide whether you live or die. I moved into a small studio apartment in Seattle, right at the peak of the relentless rainy season. It was a time when I was trying to rebuild my life after a string of consecutive failures in both my relationships and my career. I needed a place to hide out and start everything over from scratch. To cover my living expenses, I took a remote data entry job on a fixed night shift. My working hours started at 11 p.m. and lasted until 7 a.m. the next morning. This inverted lifestyle completely cut me off from the bustling daytime world. The silence within the 4 walls of the apartment wrapped around me like a heavy coat. Extreme loneliness and a desperate longing for connection left me emotionally vulnerable. I craved human interaction so much that I was ready to drop my guard for anyone who showed the slightest bit of interest. The old apartment building I lived in had narrow, poorly lit hallways, and the residents kept strictly to themselves. Hardly anyone ever interacted or even said hello when crossing paths. The only person I noticed was the man living in the room right across the hall. He was quiet and frequently went out to drop off his trash in the middle of the night, just like me. During a chance encounter by the trash chute, he took the initiative to strike up a conversation with me. He spoke in a warm, deep voice and asked about my life with genuine interest. Working these hours must be pretty lonely, right? Being so starved for someone to listen. I honestly shared everything with him. I told him about my night shift schedule, how I lived alone, and how I usually slept heavily during the day. I had no idea that my honesty had just thrown the door wide open for a living nightmare. Things began to change during the 3rd week after I moved here. The frequency of running into my neighbor in the hallway increased abnormally. Almost every single time I opened the door to step out, he was already standing there. He didn't do anything, just stood silently and watched my back. At first, I tried to rationalize everything to keep myself calm. I told myself it was just a random coincidence of 2 people living on the same warped schedule. But then, the coincidences began to cross the line of normalcy and shifted into a terrifying state. I owned a very distinctive bright yellow raincoat. It was an item I frequently wore to brave the relentless, lingering rains of Seattle. One afternoon, as I was preparing to go out, I opened the door and froze when I saw the neighbor across the hall. He was wearing a jacket with the exact same style, color, and even brand as mine. He stood backlit in the narrow corner of the hallway, watching me intently, then gave a slight nod. A few days later, the extent of his copying my personal style became much more grotesque. I naturally kept my hair shaved close on both sides of the nape and left it long on top, and he had gone and gotten the exact same haircut. As he turned his back to drop trash into the hallway chute, I stared blankly at his freshly shaved, pale scalp. A cold shiver ran down my spine, freezing me in place. He slowly turned his face around, looked straight into my eyes, and flashed an immobile smile, his eyes completely unblinking. I felt a deep discomfort surge within me, mixed with a hint of confusion. However, the fragile psyche of a lonely soul made me look for excuses to justify his behavior. Maybe he's just a lonely, eccentric guy trying to mimic my style to find some sort of connection. I tried to believe that so I wouldn't have to face the reality that I was being watched. Things escalated quickly to another level the following week. One morning, a loud, aggressive knocking on the door startled me awake in the middle of my daytime sleep. It was the delivery guy, his face looking completely flustered and panicked. He handed me a package that had its outer protective seal completely ripped open. "I am so sorry. I accidentally delivered this package to the room across from yours." I frowned in annoyance and asked why such a stupid mistake happened when my room number was clearly written. The delivery guy scratched his head, looking at me with an apologetic, defensive gaze. "I'm truly sorry, but honestly, looking from behind, you two look too much alike. From the height, the build, the yellow jacket, down to the shaved haircut at the back of your necks, everything is identical. I thought you had just walked over from that room." So I handed over the package without double-checking the room number. His words were like a bucket of ice water dumped over my long-standing self-deception. The guy in the opposite room wasn't merely mimicking my style. He was deliberately creating an identity confusion for the people around us. From that day on, the sense of security inside my apartment began to shake violently. The invasion began to shift from the outer hallway deep into my private space. I started noticing signs of my belongings being moved in completely baffling ways. My razor on the bathroom counter, which was always laid flat, was suddenly standing upright one day. The sneakers I always lined up neatly facing the door were suddenly turned backward, facing inside. A few pages in my work notebook on the desk were flipped open to a different page. I stood rooted to the floor in the middle of the room, staring blankly at those anomalies with absolute horror. Someone had been in here while I was fast asleep during the day, or when I was out. But then, the nervous exhaustion from working excessive night shifts made me doubt myself once again. It must be because I'm too tired, becoming forgetful and moving them myself without remembering. I tried to cling to that reason to evade the fear growing like a dark shadow, but the truth could not be hidden. Every time I sat working alone at 3 a.m., the surrounding silence became incredibly suffocating. I always had an intense feeling that someone was lurking, watching me through the crack of the front door. Every faint footstep out in the hallway was enough to make my heart race with panic. I woke up late one afternoon, my body completely exhausted after a long night of work. As I got out of bed, I immediately noticed a cold draft rushing in from the front door. My apartment door wasn't latched at all. It was hanging strangely ajar. I walked closer, my heart beating faster as I saw fresh scratches around the lock. True panic set in when I checked my closet. My favorite college hoodie was completely gone. It was the one with my name embroidered on the corner of the chest, the item I cherished the most. I turned back to my desk and found my work journal sitting wide open. It was stopped at a page written months ago, where I had recorded my deepest personal thoughts. On the smooth paper, a very fresh, distinct fingerprint stood out under the desk lamp. Someone had stood right here, flipping through the pages of my life while I was fast asleep during the day. The hidden camera had not been installed yet, and I was completely helpless to find any proof. Later that afternoon, I happened to run into my neighbor right in the narrow walkway of the hallway. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice calm to subtly ask him about the recent incidents. "Did you happen to see anyone lingering around my door during the day?" He did not answer my question right away. He just slowly took a step closer to me. He looked straight into my eyes, his lips slowly stretching into a warped, grotesque smile. He leaned in close to my ear and whispered in a chilling, hollow voice, "We look so much alike that I feel like I'm turning into you." My entire body broke out in goosebumps, every single hair standing up from a primal fear. Those words were not a compliment or a joke from a regular eccentric person. It was a deeply possessive declaration. He wasn't just mimicking my appearance. He wanted to consume my identity. The following night, the danger officially showed itself without any more concealment. Right at midnight, a rapid, heavy knocking shattered the dead silence of the room. I opened the door just a crack, keeping the security chain firmly engaged just in case. The neighbor stood there, holding an empty glass cup, claiming he wanted to borrow some sugar. However, His eyes never actually looked at me. They kept scanning around, taking in every single corner of the room. He was trying to memorize the layout of my furniture, the position of my bed, and the direction of my work desk. Realizing the danger was imminent, I coldly rejected him without a single second of hesitation. "I don't have any sugar, and please keep your distance from now on. Stop bothering me." I slammed the door shut, tightly turned all the deadbolts, and stood there catching my breath right behind the door. I had drawn a clear line, and I knew this relationship had officially reached the point of no return. Around 2 a.m., while I was sitting down concentrating on entering data in front of my computer screen, a tiny, sharp clicking sound coming from the front door lock made me freeze instantly. Every ambient sound seemed to be sucked out of the room, leaving only the thunderous pounding of my heart against my chest. I tiptoed forward with extremely light steps, trying not to make a single sound as I approached the door. I pressed my eye against the peephole to look out into the hallway and witnessed a horrific sight. The neighbor was pressing his pale face flat against my door, his breath fogging up the glass. In his hand was a large ring of mechanical keys, and he was continuously trying them one by one into my lock. The metallic clicking sounds clinking in the dark sounded like a death countdown. I stood frozen in terror, both hands gripping the doorframe tightly just to keep myself from collapsing onto the floor. The issue now was no longer about weirdness or crazy mimicry. He was directly threatening my safety and my life. The next morning, I couldn't sit still and take it for another single second. I immediately rushed to the nearest electronics store and bought a hidden camera cleverly disguised as a regular phone charger. When I got back to my room, I plugged it into an outlet in a hidden corner, adjusting the lens to point straight at my bed and my desk area. I needed concrete proof, something undeniable to prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy or becoming paranoid. That night, I tried to go to my data entry shift as usual, but my mind was completely consumed by that empty studio apartment. Every minute that passed felt like an entire century to me. By 7 a.m., when my shift finally ended, I rushed back home in a state of sheer exhaustion and extreme anxiety. I locked my room door tightly, slumped down onto the floor, and tremblingly pulled out my phone to open the app and check the recorded footage from last night. The timeline displayed an abnormal movement at exactly 3:14 a.m. I pressed play and instantly my heart seemed to stop, the blood in my veins freezing completely. The phone screen showed my front door handle, slowly turning in an incredibly smooth motion. The door opened, and the figure of my neighbor stepped inside, holding a fake key crafted with terrifying precision. He wasn't in a rush at all. His movements were so natural and casual it was sickening, as if he were walking into his own home. He slowly walked around the narrow room, using his gaunt fingers to touch each of my personal belongings, from my notebook and water mug to the clothes hanging on the rack. After that, he approached my bed. He climbed right into it, lying down exactly where I usually slept, pulling the blanket up and clutching my pillow with a sense of profound satisfaction. His eyes rolled back, staring blankly at the ceiling for 30 straight minutes without a single blink. But the most horrific part of the footage was yet to come. As he slowly walked into my bathroom, he stood in front of the mirror, turned on the light, and nonchalantly picked up my razor to stroke it against his face. He pressed his pale face close against the polished glass, his lips moving as he whispered something in utter madness. I had to bring my ear right next to the phone speaker, turning the volume all the way up to hear the spine-chilling sound coming from the clip. "You are about to be set free. This life will be mine starting tomorrow." His erratic whisper echoed like a death sentence to my very existence. My absolute terror turned into a sudden wave of sheer panic that triggered every single one of my nerves. Without another thought, I grabbed my laptop, bolted straight out into the hallway, and ran frantically down to the street. Outside, a massive Seattle storm was pouring down violently, icy rain slamming hard against my face. I stood under an old bus shelter, my hands shaking so violently that I almost dropped my phone while dialing 911. I screamed into the phone, begging the police to come save me because a madman was trying to steal my life. About 15 minutes later, 2 police cars with blaring sirens pulled up to the old apartment building. I led them rushing up to the 3rd floor, pointing straight at the neighbor's door across the hall. The police officers drew their guns, repeatedly banging on the door and shouting commands to open up, but it was completely silent inside. They had to use a breaching tool to break down his door. But he had already escaped, through the back fire exit, leaving behind an empty space that contained the most sickening secrets. When I stepped into his room alongside the police, my knees completely buckled at the sight before me. Across all four walls of the cramped room, he had plastered hundreds of stalker photos of me from every angle. From when I took out the trash, when I went to the supermarket, to photos taken right through my window while I was sleeping during the day. My eyes blurred with absolute horror as I looked at the wooden table in the center of the room. It was a brand new fake passport, bearing the neighbor's portrait, but all the personal information, name, date of birth, and even the social security number belonged entirely to me. He was no longer just a stalker or a typical psycho. He had laid out a perfect plan to completely erase my identity from this world and legitimately take over my life. The police immediately issued an arrest warrant for my neighbor that very stormy night, but he had completely vanished into the thick, cold fog of Seattle. Not a single trace, not a single clue was left behind, besides that room filled with stalker photos. The very next day, I decided to break my lease and accepted losing my entire security deposit. I threw away all of my old belongings, from the bed and clothes down to a regular drinking mug. I couldn't stand the feeling that my life had been defiled and violated by him in such a sickening way. I packed the bare minimum of my luggage and immediately caught a flight to a completely different state all the way on the East Coast. I chose to rent an apartment on a high floor of a modern building to seek a sense of security. This place has multi-layered security, specific key cards for each floor, and 24/7 security guards on duty. I even paid out of my own pocket to install 3 additional layers of smart security locks inside the front door. However, those heavy locks could not stop the collapse from within my own mind. That horrific event left behind a massive psychological trauma that turned me into a paranoid wreck. I fell into a state of extreme panic that lasted for months and required psychological therapy. Every single night, I would wake up in a cold sweat at exactly 3 a.m. because of the nightmares. I would fumbly turn on my phone, checking the security cameras constantly every hour just to make sure no one was standing there watching me. 2 years have passed since that horrific night in Seattle, but the absolute terror from back then has permanently changed how I perceive people and trust in this society. My peace of mind was stolen by him and will never return. Now, every time I walk down the street on a rainy day and accidentally see someone wearing a yellow jacket from behind, my heart tightens up and my breath catches in my throat from panic. I will immediately turn around and hide inside the nearest convenience store to avoid that figure. This painful experience taught me a costly lesson about the loneliness of being an outsider. Extreme loneliness can make us blindly accept the attention of strangers. It makes us lower our guard and forget to question the true motives behind their casual check-ins. Closeness without strict boundaries is never a healthy friendship. It is the very beginning of a brutal plot to control and consume your identity. If one day someone appears and tries everything to become a second version of you, trust your instincts. Believe them, and run away immediately. That summer in Montana brought an unprecedented record-breaking heat wave. I was trying to escape the suffocating reality of my life inside a run-down, dust-covered log cabin. This place sat completely isolated in the middle of a barren and desolate grassland. The air was constantly hot and sweltering, like a massive open-air kiln. Outside the window, the ceaseless buzzing of cicadas day and night made my head feel like it was about to explode. It was truly the darkest and most exhausting period of my life. A broken marriage had just come to a close after a grueling series of disputes. The prolonged divorce proceedings had drained every last penny from my pockets. I fell into a state of severe depression, helplessness, and utter loneliness within those 4 wooden walls. The terrifying silence of this wilderness began to suffocate what little sanity I had left. It created an invisible, gaping void in my heart. That feeling made me crave any kind of human connection, even if it was just hearing another voice. On the old dining table, dozens of overdue bills had piled up into a thick stack. The red numbers served as a constant reminder that I would soon be thrown out on the street if I did not find money immediately. During a sleepless night, I aimlessly scrolled through a small local classifieds forum. A strange job posting suddenly caught my eye. Its content was written very briefly and concisely. Looking for someone to read novels aloud to an elderly. Visually impaired writer every evening at sunset, $500 per hour. $500 just to read a book for 1 hour. For someone on the verge of bankruptcy like me, that amount was a fortune. But my instinct and reason immediately rang a massive alarm bell. The pay rate was completely absurd for such a simple job at a remote ranch. There was definitely something shady or dangerous hiding behind this offer. But the poverty, the desperation, and the suffocating loneliness blurred my judgment. I convinced myself that this was just the typical eccentricity of a wealthy old man. I did not want to face this terrifying silence for another second. I picked up the phone, took a deep breath, and decided to call the number. I drove my old car along dirt roads full of dust and gravel. On both sides of the road were cracked canyons under the scorching Montana sun. After more than an hour of driving, a massive and completely isolated cattle ranch appeared before me. Stepping out from the porch was a young man, neatly dressed and elegant. He introduced himself as Silas. The only caretaker on the property, Silas welcomed me with a warm and polite smile. He thoughtfully handed me a cold glass of lemonade to wash away the sweltering heat of the late afternoon. The drive here must have been dusty and tiring. Please have some water to quench your thirst. The way Silas listened and sympathized with my casual complaints about the weather instantly dropped all my defenses. I felt truly welcomed and respected in this strange place. Silas led me deep into the main house of the ranch. He opened the door and stepped into a huge study, but the thick curtains were all tightly drawn. The space inside was dim, suffocating, and strangely silent. In the corner of the room, the elderly writer Thomas sat motionlessly in a high-backed armchair. His back was completely turned toward the entrance, facing into the deep darkness of the room. Silas handed me the first manuscript prepared on the table. "Just read loud and clear. I will step outside so as not to disturb your private space." I opened the manuscript and began reading the first lines aloud. The only sound echoing was my own voice, clinging to the stillness. There was absolutely no response from the armchair, except for a very faint and intermittent wheezing breath. That night, after returning to my cabin, I received a very long text message from Silas. He praised my deep and expressive voice, saying that I had done an excellent job. Silas revealed that Mr. Thomas really enjoyed today's reading session, and that the old man had even smiled after months of melancholy and depression. That compliment made me feel valued and eased some of the surrounding loneliness. But right after that, my phone buzzed again with a follow-up text containing a subtle, loaded statement from Silas. He is very sensitive to light, and once he has chosen someone to share his world, he will want them to read until the very last page of their life. By the third session, the summer sky suddenly took a turn for the worse. A violent thunderstorm rolled in, with flashes of lightning ripping through the sky. Torrential rain poured down, raising the risk of flash floods around the ranch area. The entire region's power grid was completely knocked out shortly after. The main house plunged into heavy darkness, lit only by sudden flashes from outside the window. My phone suddenly buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Silas. "I'm stuck at the back stables fixing the backup generator that suddenly broke down. Just go into the study ahead of me because Mr. Thomas is waiting." I turned on my phone's flashlight to guide my way into the familiar study. But the moment I stepped through the thick wooden door, I froze. A pungent smell of mold mixed with half-burnt candle wax hit my nose. It was absolutely not the typical musty smell of an old house. It carried a bizarrely sweet, rancid stench of animal flesh decomposing over a long period under the summer heat. The odor was so thick it made my chest tighten and made me nauseous. A profound sense of dread washed down my spine. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure, and approached the armchair closer than usual. I told myself I just needed to check on the old man, or help him adjust his light blanket. I lifted my phone, directing the flashlight beam toward the high-backed armchair. As the light swept over the edge of the blanket, my heart skipped a beat. Mr. Thomas's hand was sticking out. His flesh had turned a lifeless, ash-gray color. The fingertips were curled up, bone-dry and ice-cold like a piece of dead wood. My entire body trembled violently with horror. I backed up a few steps, almost dropping my phone onto the floor. The flashlight beam accidentally grazed a file folder sitting on the reading table that Silas had prepared. Trembling, I stepped closer and used one hand to flip open the cover of the file. What appeared before my eyes were not the lines of a detective novel. They were copies of local police investigation reports, stamped with red confidential seals. The contents detailed the mysterious disappearances of 3 young girls in this county over the past 2 years. My breathing became shallow and caught in my throat. I quickly flipped to the final page of the file under the flickering light. My eyes widened as I saw a sharp portrait photograph. Below the picture was a resume and a detailed, hour-by-hour daily schedule. It was the exact information of the woman who had held this reading job right before me. I tremblingly dropped the stack of investigation files onto the wooden table. Cold sweat poured down my body, despite the sweltering and suffocating air inside the sealed room. The survival instinct in my head was screaming violently that I had to escape immediately. I hurriedly turned around, intending to rush toward the main door, but a tall, dark shadow was already standing there, blocking the exit out of nowhere. It was Silas. He looked at me with a soulless, motionless smile on his lips. Silas's voice rang out deep and low. There was not a single bit of warmth or elegance left like in the first days. It became flat and bone-chillingly cold. "You haven't finished today's part yet. Our lesson has only just begun," coldly. Right at that moment, a blinding flash of lightning ripped through the night sky outside the window. The fierce white light flashed in a split second and shone directly on the high-backed armchair in the corner of the room. That beam of light exposed a horrifying truth that the darkness had tried to conceal. A thick steel wire was wrapped tightly multiple times around Mr. Thomas's neck and chest. It held the heavily decomposing corpse firmly secured to the back of the chair. My throat choked up, and I could not utter a single cry for help. Silas began to slowly step toward me. His hand lazily pulled out a gleaming metal box cutter. The sound of the blade clicking up notch by notch echoed dryly and clearly in the dead silence. In utter panic with nowhere left to run, I decided to gamble with my life. I reached out and grabbed the heavy brass desk lamp right next to me. Using every ounce of strength I had, I threw the lamp hard, straight at his face. The brass lamp hit its mark, causing Silas to stumble backward. He clutched his face and let out a furious groan. I capitalized on that precious brief second to run for my life out of the study door. I ran like a maniac through the dark hallway of the main house. I pushed open the porch door and plunged straight out into the pouring summer torrential rain. I rushed to my old car and scrambled into the driver's seat. My hands and feet were trembling so violently that I almost dropped the key onto the floor. I frantically jammed the key into the ignition, started the engine, and slammed on the gas pedal. The car roared fiercely and then sped away into the dark night. The tires spun wildly, kicking up splatters of dirty mud, leaving that wicked ranch far behind me. I drove straight to the county sheriff's office in a state of utter panic and exhaustion. I couldn't stop crying as I recounted the entire horrifying ordeal that had just happened. The next morning, armed law enforcement surrounded and raided the ranch. They discovered Mr. Thomas's body, determining he had been dead for over a month. Even more shocking, they unearthed the remains of the 3 missing girls hidden in the underground basement. Silas, however, had completely vanished without a trace. I immediately packed up my belongings and panic-sold my cabin in Montana. I relocated to a major city on the West Coast to hide away. But the psychological scars can never be erased. Every single night, I am tormented by my own foolishness. My intuition had screamed that something was wrong right from the start, but I chose to ignore it, blinded by the money and the suffocating loneliness. Now, whenever twilight sets in and darkness floods the room, fear paralyzes me. I never dare to open a book and read out loud by myself again. A relentless paranoia constantly haunts my mind. I always get the feeling that Silas is standing right there in the shadows behind me, clutching that metal box cutter, whispering into my ear. "You have to finish reading the conclusion of the story," coldly. That near-death experience left me with a brutal lesson. Loneliness is a lethal trap. It breaks down your defenses and delivers you straight to the predators. Never silence the voice of your intuition. Never accept a counterfeit connection when it demands you compromise yourself. Your safety, your boundaries, and your life are absolutely priceless.